Do you think that China's attitude towards Europe, like even pre the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has had any effect on how Europe has seen China over the last few years, like with COVID? Also, like that sudden, well, it seemed sudden scrapping of that deal, the economic deal between the EU and China. Like, were there things happening already pre-Russia that were affecting Europe-China relations?
Yeah, absolutely. This is not something that's now coming out of the blue. Relations between Europe and China had been souring for several years, and for a number of reasons. One of them was like, I don't know, people used to say, China and Central and Eastern Europe were really close. That was never really the case, and in part that was because Central and Eastern European countries had hoped for much more investment from China, and that just never really came through. So they were already not very enthusiastic. Then in the bigger in Germany, the German government had introduced investment screening because they were getting nervous about China buying up basically all successful and more advanced German companies. Basically, after a German robotics maker was taken over by a Chinese company, they started panicking about that. Then you had the COVID shock, where I think the Chinese government reaction to that, and the way it was like very demanding and very much asking for public praise for its own COVID policies and thanks, and I don't know, three bows and maybe dancing on the tarmac for every delivery of masks or any other PPE did not impress people. The fact that the handling had allowed COVID to spread, and now China was asking for praise for its handling of the outbreak, that did not go down well. And then the episode you're referring to, Shelley, last year, when the European Parliament sanctioned actually a very small number of Chinese officials, plus the Bingtuan, the Xinjiang production, the what's the English name? I keep forgetting.
Like XPPC or
Xinjiang
something.
Production and Construction
Yeah.
Corps.
Wow.
When they sanctioned them, plus a small number of fairly minor officials, then China hit back with like very major sanctions against parliamentarians and against think tanks, including my former employer, Mareike. That really did not go down well. So that was when the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment was put on hold, on ice. And I don't know. I don't think it's dead until I've buried it myself, but I do think there's not very high chance of that being resurrected anytime soon, because I don't see China removing their sanctions. China is basically saying you need to remove your sanctions first. I don't really see that happening. The EU removing its sanctions on those Xinjiang officials plus the Bingtuan. I don't think that's viable. It's a viable option for them at the moment, for good reason. So I don't really see that that's going to be resurrected anytime soon. And with China now so clearly, even though it's officially neutral, but quite clearly through its words and actions siding with Russia, that is not going down well. This boils down to this being it's an existential issue for large parts of Central and Eastern Europe, including the Baltic states, which I think China still doesn't fully understand, that this is like what itself would call a core interest and an existential issue for those countries. And I don't think it's fully realized that the way this is discussed in Germany is essentially what we have here is another madman throwing Europe into chaos. So basically drawing a parallel with Hitler Germany here. Not a one-on-one parallel, because there are obviously is luckily not at that level yet, but it is very much viewed as unacceptable to side with Russia on this one in Germany as well.
Well, don't worry. We're on the internet. We can compare everything and anyone to Hitler.
Well, I was actually thinking.
My point is, you don't usually do that in Germany. It's like it's a big no-no for historical reasons. But it started happening again. Like, people are sort of doing that, and there's basically what people are saying is what we currently see is something we hope to never see again after 1945. That's usually how it's phrased. So they don't say Putin is Hitler or anything, but they do see what we currently see is something we haven't seen since 1945, and that we were hoping to never, ever see again in our lifetimes. And that's a pretty strong framing of the, like, that's, you know, that's maybe not as existential as it is Central and Eastern Europe, but it's very much viewed as the way it's often, the term often used is the breaking of civilized norms or the breaking of civilization, or basically, yeah. It's viewed, like, Germans have strong opinions on this too.
Yeah. They don't want to say Hitler, they just draw a little mustache on Putin.
Maybe.
But what it reminds me of is, because if Putin is the equivalent, if Putin's Russia is the equivalent of Nazi Germany in this scenario, is China the equivalent of Imperial Japan in that scenario, where you've got this alliance of powers that, like, you know, Nazi Germany and Japan, like, they had some common interests, but they're also very, very different, right? And also, you know, one of them, but they probably both thought the other was inferior, racially as well as otherwise. But so, like, this is like a weird thing, right? And so, like, the China-Russia alliance also seems to be like, you've got so many cultural differences and ideological differences, like that. To me, seems that it would put that alliance at risk.
I don't think people would, you know, I wouldn't know of anyone who would draw on such a comparison. And I do honestly, and with all my heart, hope we don't get into a situation where we have anything comparable to what we had in World War III, because, in World War II, to what we heard, but, you know, I just hope we don't get there.
Well, fortunately, the person who hates that comparison the most is China, hating to be compared to Japan. So maybe for that reason, they'll avoid it.
They can stop them from expanding in the Pacific.
Right. Well, I mean, so this kind of brings it back to something we were talking about earlier, which is that Russia is blaming NATO for this, in a sense, right? Like, oh, if NATO hadn't been so strong or aggressive or whatever, or the running dog of America, then, like, this wouldn't have happened.
If NATO had pinky swear to never let Ukraine in, we wouldn't have been forced to invade to protect ourselves.
Right.
Yeah. And
so that argument is stupid, but also I think it's important to look at that and understand whether some kind of equivalent, NATO equivalent, but with respect to China, might be of value.
So I think one thing that China has done in this war is, and this kind of what puts it in this weird position, because, you know, it talks about Russia's legitimate security interests, but then it's also always very quick to point out that, you know, Taiwan and Ukraine not the same, because Taiwan is not a country, and Ukraine, you know, we're not going to comment on what Ukraine is because we don't want to offend Russia, but we're not going to say it's not a country because we do recognize it, and we do have a security agreement with Ukraine. I think China basically promised to defend Ukraine in case it ever suffered a nuclear attack. I think that was in the agreement. So they can't fully say, you know, Ukraine is just a part of Russia. But they're very quick to point out that, you know, Taiwan's different because it's not a country, and nobody recognizes Taiwan as a country, as the Chinese government would say. So I think what they're doing right now, while they are trying to give maximum support to Russia, I think they also do try to keep up the rhetorical framework that basically says, of course, it's completely our legitimate interest to take Taiwan because it's not a country and it's ours. And when we do that, it's not even going to be comparable to what Russia is doing in Ukraine, even though I don't think they've come out and directly said that, but that's kind of implied. It's not going to be comparable because, you know, that's simply a province of ours, and we have every right. And I think they've tried to incorporate that in much of their language. And I think at some point, I forgot where the reference was. Maybe you can help me. But at some point, they made this comment how China is the only country that hasn't, realized full national reunification. They included that in the statement as part of a commentary on the war in Ukraine. So they're trying to keep laying that rhetorical groundwork on basically denying Taiwan the right to exist as an independent political entity. And it runs into trouble drawing direct comparisons with Ukraine because it also recognizes Ukraine as an independent country. So it's a difficult position, but then again, hypocrisy is not really a huge problem for the CCP. So they're doing their best